response to the Church of England's endorsement of the blessing of same-sex unions in the church. And in Anglicanism, the Church of England's the mother church, so though it's this completely sick institution, dying institution, has been forever. But the Archbishop of Canterbury is recognized as the first among equals, as the senior bishop in the communion. Again,
which is in contrast to maybe how people would think of the hierarchy within the Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's very different, but it's at the same time, Anglicanism is the most structured, though it's really a confederation than any other church on earth, even more so than the Orthodox churches, because the Orthodox churches never meet. Even though they're autocephalous, they're entities to themselves, like the province of the Anglican Communion. The fact is, the Orthodox bishops haven't met together for hundreds of years. So Anglican bishops do meet since 1867, every 10 years. And the Lambeth Conference really was the glue that kept much of Anglicanism together, especially around the difference in those from the origins of Anglicanism's arguments weren't about sexuality. You can't imagine this, that the sex didn't dominate the life of the church until relatively recently. It used to be about churchmanship.
Right.
Especially in the Anglican synthesis, ever since the Elizabethan settlement in 1559. There was always a Catholic ethos to Anglicanism and a rather Protestant Reformed ethos. And they lived together within the same national church, using the same Book of Common Prayer, the same confession, and yet they emphasized quite different things. One, the Catholic side, emphasizing the medieval continuity of the Church of England, Anglicanism, with the Latin Church, and the more Protestant side of Anglicanism being more in tune with magisterial reformers on the continent.
Yeah.
And so this tension has always been part of the rubber band in Anglicanism. It's unique to the Anglican synthesis, and yet it had a ministerial system of hierarchy of bishops, priests, and deacons. And so it's known as the Via Media. It's the middle way between Roman Catholicism in the Latin West and mainline Protestantism. That's not an exact truth, but it's generally true. But the sex thing has just utterly dominated everything. Really, almost my whole 30 years as a priest, it's dominated every aspect. And the eroding of traditional doctrines of marriage, sexuality, has just been chipped away at, where now it's all gone. Transgender priests. The Episcopal Church last year gave its official endorsement to transgenderism.
That's right.
And all of it, right? And as you know, I wrote back in 2003. I wrote a treatise that got published and went online, and this was just about the Robinson consecration. And it wasn't my version of Ratzinger, but I said, this is going to lead to this. It's going to lead to this. It's going to lead to this. This can of worms is going to lead, and of course, it all happened. You have to be a genius to see what was going to happen, but it's all happened, right? From gay couples with in vitro fertilization, baptizing kids who were never conceived by conjugal union, were made in petri dishes, and all this stuff, like this is the will of God. And so it's so big, this issue, and it's not complicated, but it has so many tributaries. And
it's pretty wide-reaching.
It's unbelievable, right? So I say all that to say that GAFCON in this spring met, I think it was their fourth meeting, and they basically fired the Archbishop of Canterbury. Right?
Pretty much.
They decided, as the two-thirds world, that they were no longer going to recognize the Archbishop of Canterbury, because as the titular head of the communion, he fully endorsed the whole sexual agenda in the Church of England, including the sexuality issues and the blessing of same-sex unions. And two-thirds world, like, you can't be the spiritual father of an international worldwide communion, right? It's the third largest communion in the world,
right,
to Catholicism, Orthodoxy, but it's the second most spread out to Catholicism. So you find Anglicanism in more places in the world than anything but Catholicism, no other denomination. Orthodoxy is in very distinct spots and not found anywhere in other spots. But Anglicanism is found wherever the British Empire went throughout the world. So it's virtually everywhere. Now, for the two-thirds world, and when I say the two-thirds world, it's not just the old understanding of the geography of the two-thirds world,
Yeah.
right? It's literally two-thirds of all Anglicans are in Africa and the sub-Saharan continent.
And it's 2/3 with regard to population.
Yes.
The world.
Right. So the minority, and it's growing incrementally smaller every day, are white, European, English, people of English heritage.
Anglo-Saxon.
Anglo-Saxons, right? And while those churches, the Church of England, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Scotland, they all shrink every day at an astronomical rate. At one point in Nigeria and Uganda, there was 1,000 converts a week.
Which is hard to wrap your mind around.
So there's these two polar opposite things going on in the communion, right? And so all this progressive stuff's going on in the old center of the communion, the Canterbury Communion, and they're dying, and they keep pushing progressive ideas, like somehow that's going to grow the church and actually convert culture. It's nonsense. And meanwhile, the church has exploded, right? So to give the example, Uganda, Idi Amin, of infamy, 1977, had murdered on the tarmac at the capital of the country, Janani Luwum, who is the Anglican Archbishop of Uganda, was murdered by the dictator. And at the time, Uganda was the least Christian country on earth. And today, it is the most Christian country on earth, because the blood of the seed, the blood of the martyrs is
the seed of the church.
Seed of the church, right? And the sickness and the irony of all of this is that it was missionaries, predominantly from the Church of England in America, that brought the gospel to Africa. And the missionaries had, depending on where they came from, if they came from America, they tend to be high church. They came from England, they tend to be low church. And so the different countries and provinces in Africa are either very Catholic or very Protestant, depending on which one evangelized them. But they resent the fact that the empire and the Americans brought the gospel to the continent, and then 150 years later tell them how they're all bigots because they actually believe the gospel that was brought to them by the missionaries. Right? And somehow that's not racism. It's total cultural racism.
Oh, yeah, rhetorically speaking, right. And we were talking about this off camera, that it's really a form of neo-colonialism.
Yes.
And it's ironic because they claim to be the ones who are most against colonialism
You dumb
itself.
people, right? It's like you're not sophisticated enough to think like us.
It's an ideological colonialism.
It's disgusting, right? And so it's and it's not just that the Church of England passed same-sex blessings. It's that the Archbishop himself pushed it and endorsed it and gave it his imprimatur.
Yes.
And for them, that's just the breaking point. And so they basically withdrew from the Anglican Communion, and they're going to elect their own first among equals. And so the Anglican world is roughly 85 million, and now 65 to 70 to 75 million of them will belong to the two-thirds world. And meanwhile, the other 15 million dying people will pretend that they're self-righteous and we're really we're on the right side of history and all the other nonsense that you hear from progressive Christianity. And the fact is, they're going to cease to exist in 20 years. And meanwhile, Christianity will continue to grow and be influential
in the global south.
In the global south. And, but you know what? When you don't really believe Jesus is Lord anymore, you don't care about any of those things.